She signed the consent form with a shaking hand. "I'll give him my liver," and 2 months later, while her scar was still healing, he slid divorce papers across the table and whispered, "You were never meant to stay." If this moment stirred something painful or familiar in you, stay with this story. And if you believe love should never require someone to bleed in silence, let your presence be felt, stand with her, leave a trace of your support, and let this story know it's not being heard alone. Subscribe, like and comment where you are watching from. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet panic. Not the loud kind, the shouting, rushing kind, but the silent panic that settled into waiting rooms and stayed there. The kind that folded itself into plastic chairs, half-empty coffee cups, and eyes that refused to look away from closed doors. Grace Moore sat alone by the window, her palms pressed flat against her thighs as if she were afraid her hands might drift away if she relaxed them. Outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, cars inching forward, people laughing at nothing important, life moving on without permission. Inside, Grace's world had narrowed to a single hallway, single-roomed, single man fighting to stay alive. Her husband, Troy Moore, 39, once confident, once admired, now reduced to test results clipped to the foot of a hospital bed and a diagnosis spoken carefully, like words that could shatter glass. Acute liver failure. No long warning. No time to prepare. Just collapse. The doctors had explained it clinically, but Grace heard it emotionally. Without a transplant, he will die. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. You promised, she thought, not to God, not to fate, but to Troy. 8 years ago. In a chapel filled with light and witnesses who believed love was enough. She had promised to stay. Grace had always been the one who stayed. She stayed when Troy's first business dream collapsed under debt. She stayed when his ambition hardened into impatience. She stayed when affection thinned and conversations became practical instead of tender. She told herself this was marriage, endurance dressed up as loyalty. At 35, Grace had learned how to make herself smaller without disappearing. How to sense tension before it surfaced. How to give without keeping score, because keeping score meant admitting there might be an ending. Her mother once told her, "Love is what you're willing to lose." Grace had taken that lesson too far. She rested a hand on her abdomen without knowing why, unaware that this place, this exact place, would soon hold a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. Troy lay staring at the ceiling, counting tiles because it was the only thing he could still control. He hated weakness, hated dependency, hated the way nurses softened their voices around him, as if his pride were something fragile. Once, he had been the man people relied on. Now he was the one waiting to be saved. A living donor is your best chance, the doctor had said. Troy knew what that meant. There were only a few people who could qualify, and only one who would say yes without asking questions. Grace. The thought comforted him, and unsettled him. Because buried beneath the fear of dying was a truth Troy hadn't spoken, not even to himself. He had already begun imagining a life that didn't include her. When Troy finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic. It never was. They sat across from each other in a small consultation room, a box of tissues untouched between them. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice thinner than she remembered. "The doctor says there's an option." She nodded. "I know. You do." "Yes." Her certainty startled him. "You'd have to be tested," Troy continued. "It's major surgery. I wouldn't ask if there were another way." "I'll do it," she said. The words fell heavy and final. Troy blinked. "You don't even know the risks." "I know enough." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. This was what Grace did best, choosing certainty when everyone else was afraid. Dr. Nathan Cole explained the risks. The recovery. The percentages no one liked to dwell on. Grace listened, nodded once, then reached for the pen. She signed the consent form with a shaking hand. "I'll give him my liver," she said softly. Troy exhaled, relief pouring out of him like a confession. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll never forget this." Grace smiled. She didn't know yet that forgetting would be the easiest part. If you've ever been the one who stayed when it hurt, the one who gave because walking away felt impossible, pause here. Let this story know you're still listening. Sometimes, staying with a story is how we honor the people inside it. The morning of the surgery arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sunrise, no thunder. Just a pale gray sky and the low hum of hospital lights that never slept. Grace Moore lay on a narrow bed in a paper-thin gown, the fabric rustling every time she breathed. The room felt too bright, too clean, like it had been scrubbed of anything human. A nurse adjusted the four in her arm, murmuring reassurances that floated past Grace without landing. Her focus was fixed on one thing. Troy. He stood near the door, arms crossed, trying to look strong. But the strength didn't quite reach his eyes. They kept darting, toward the monitors, the clock, the consent forms clipped to a board. Toward her. "You don't have to do this," he said for the third time, voice tight. Grace turned her head slowly to look at him. "We've been over this." "I know, he stopped, swallowed. "I hate that you're the one paying the price for my body failing." She almost laughed. If only you knew what this price would really buy, she thought. Instead, she said softly, "You're my husband. This is what we do." The words sounded right. Familiar. Safe. Even as something in her chest whispered that they were no longer true. Dr. Nathan Cole entered moments later, calm and efficient, holding a tablet. "Grace Troy," he said evenly. "This is your last chance to reconsider. Once we begin, there's no undoing it." Grace nodded before he finished speaking. "I'm ready." Dr. Cole studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Not her vitals. Her face. "You understand the recovery will be long," he said. "Months before you feel like yourself again. Pain. Fatigue. There's a scar that—" "I understand," she interrupted gently. Troy shifted. "She understands," he echoed, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Grace signed the final document with a hand that shook despite her resolve. She signed away a piece of herself. They wheeled her down the hallway, ceiling lights sliding past like a countdown. Troy walked beside her, fingers wrapped tightly around hers. "I owe you everything," he said suddenly. "When this is over, I promise things will be different." Grace looked up at him. Different how? He hesitated just long enough for doubt to flicker. "Better," he said. "We'll start fresh." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. As the doors to the operating room swung open, Troy leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you," he whispered. Grace searched his face for something. Fear, gratitude, devotion, anything that felt permanent. "I know," she said. The doors closed between them with a soft, final click. 6 hours passed. 6 hours where Grace's body was opened, altered, rearranged so another person could live. 6 hours where Troy paced waiting room floors worn smooth by desperation, his phone buzzing endlessly in his pocket with messages he didn't answer. When Dr. Cole finally emerged, mask pulled down, exhaustion lining his face, Troy sprang to his feet. "She's stable," the doctor said. "The transplant went beautifully. Your liver is functioning. Her remaining liver will regenerate over time." Troy exhaled, knees weakening. "And Grace? She's in recovery. It will be painful, but she's strong." Troy nodded, relief washing over him so completely it almost felt like rebirth. He didn't notice the absence of something else. Guilt. Grace woke to pain. Not sharp at first, just a deep, all-consuming ache that made it hard to breathe. Then the nausea hit. Then the fog. When her eyes finally focused, Troy was there, sitting stiffly in a chair beside her bed. "You did it," he said, voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Grace tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Worth it," she whispered. Troy leaned forward and kissed her forehead. The gesture was familiar, but something about it felt practiced. Obligatory. Not anchored. Over the next days, doctors came and went. Nurses adjusted medications. Visitors brought flowers and praise. "You're a hero. What an incredible wife, he's so lucky to have you." Grace listened from her bed, drifting in and out of sleep, her body learning how to exist with less than it used to have. Troy stayed. But not the way she expected. He took calls in the hallway. Left early. Returned late. Sat scrolling through his phone when he thought she was asleep. Once when she woke suddenly, she caught him staring at her, not with tenderness, but with something closer to calculation. She closed her eyes again before he noticed. 2 weeks after the surgery, Grace was discharged. She went home with painkillers, instructions, and a body that felt foreign. Troy drove them back to the house they shared, hands tight on the wheel. "This is just temporary," he said, as if speaking to himself. "Once I'm fully recovered, once you're stronger, things will settle." Grace nodded. But at night, lying awake while pain pulsed through her side, she felt it clearly. Something had already moved. And it wasn't settling back into place. If you've ever given something sacred believing it would bring you closer, only to feel distance grow instead, stay with this story. Let your presence here mean something. Sometimes listening is how we honor sacrifices that were never thanked. Recovery did not look the way Grace had imagined. She thought healing would feel like progress, small victories stacked carefully into normalcy. Instead, it felt like living inside a body that no longer trusted her. Every movement pulled at stitches beneath her skin. Every breath reminded her of what was missing. Troy healed faster. Too fast. By the third week, his color had returned. By the fourth, he was back at the gym, just to keep his strength up. By the sixth, he was talking about work again, about plans, about what came next. Grace watched him reclaim his life while she was still negotiating with pain. "You should rest," he told her one afternoon, already dressed to leave. "I've been resting," she replied quietly. "I'd like to sit outside." He checked his watch. "Maybe later." "I'm running late." Later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became never. Grace didn't confront him, not yet. She told herself she was being patient. That he needed time to process everything he'd survived. That gratitude sometimes came quietly, privately. But silence has weight. At night, Troy lay beside her without touching her. His back turned. His phone glowing softly beneath the covers long after he thought she was asleep. Once, she reached for his hand. He flinched. "I'm tired," he said quickly. "The meds mess with my sleep." Grace withdrew her hand and stared into the dark. Maybe I'm asking too much, she thought. Maybe this is just part of healing. But the distance kept growing, filling the room like cold air. Her doctor had warned her about emotional recovery. Sometimes donors feel disconnected, Dr. Nathan Cole had said. Like they gave something away and expected it to change the relationship. Grace hadn't expected miracles. She had only expected care. She told herself not to count. Not to keep track of how often Troy left early. Not to notice how rarely he asked how she was feeling. Not to wonder why he avoided looking at her scar. She resisted the truth the way people resist storms, by pretending the sky was still blue. Troy avoided the bedroom whenever he could. He told himself it was temporary. That once Grace felt better, everything would return to normal. But something in him recoiled when he looked at her. Not disgust. Fear. Her scar was proof. Her pain was evidence. Her sacrifice was something he didn't know how to repay. And instead of leaning into that discomfort, he pulled away from it. It was easier to distance himself than to sit with the weight of what she had done. One evening, Grace finally spoke. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Troy looked up. "Think about what?" "The surgery," she said. "What it cost." He shrugged. "I try not to dwell on it. It's in the past now." The words landed hard. The past. Her pain wasn't past. Her fatigue wasn't past. Her scar wasn't past. "Oh," she said quietly. "Okay." Troy missed the way her shoulders sank. Missed the moment something fragile inside her began to close. Grace considered asking him outright. "Are you still in this? Do you still love me? Was I just convenient?" But asking meant risking answers she wasn't ready to hear. So she stayed silent. She smiled when he spoke. She nodded when he reassured her vaguely. She pretended the distance wasn't growing wider by the day. Resistance can look like strength from the outside. Inside, it feels like suffocating slowly. If you've ever felt someone pulling away while you were still bleeding, pause here. Let this story know you're still listening. Some silences only break when someone chooses not to leave. The emergency happened on a Tuesday. Grace remembered because Tuesdays used to be ordinary, laundry days, grocery lists, quiet routines that made life feel stable. This Tuesday shattered that illusion. She was alone in the house when the pain hit. Not the familiar ache she'd learned to manage, but something sharper, sudden, breath-stealing, radiating from her side down into her legs. Her knees buckled before she could reach the counter. The world tilted. Grace hit the floor hard, the sound loud enough to echo through the empty house. She lay there, gasping, hand pressed against her incision as nausea surged. Her phone was on the kitchen table. Too far. For the first time since the surgery, fear, not pain, took hold. When Troy finally burst through the emergency room doors, his face was pale, eyes wide with something dangerously close to panic. "Where is she?" he demanded the first nurse he saw. "Room 14. Grace lay curled on the hospital bed, fur already in her arm, tears streaking silently down her temples. Troy stopped short at the sight of her. He hadn't seen her like this. Not really. Not stripped of composure. Not reduced to shaking breaths and whispered apologies to nurses. I'm sorry," Grace murmured when she saw him. "I didn't mean to." "Stop," he said sharply, crossing the room in 3 strides. "Don't apologize." The words came out harsher than he intended. But his hands shook as he reached for hers. Dr. Nathan Cole arrived minutes later, his expression serious. "Internal strain," he explained. "Nothing life-threatening, but it's a reminder, Grace's body is still healing. She pushed too hard." Troy exhaled slowly. "She didn't tell me." Grace closed her eyes. "She didn't want to worry you," the doctor said gently. "They were told she'd need to stay overnight for observation. No visitors, no excuses, no distance. Just the 2 of them, trapped in a small room with beeping monitors and truths pressing against the walls." Later, when Grace slept under medication, Troy sat alone in the hallway, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. A nurse passed, then paused. "You're the husband, right?" He nodded. "She's strong," the nurse said softly. "But strength doesn't mean she doesn't need you." The words cut deeper than he expected. Grace woke sometime after midnight. The room was dim, quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines. Troy sat beside her bed. Not scrolling. Not distracted. Just sitting there. "You scared me," he said quietly. "I scared myself," she replied. Silence stretched between them, thick, fragile. "I didn't realize how bad it still was," he admitted. I guess I thought once the surgery was over, everything else would just reset." Grace swallowed. "I don't reset that fast," she said. "I gave something away, Troy. And I don't know who I am without it yet." He looked at her then. Really looked. The scar. The exhaustion. The woman who had almost disappeared trying to save him. "I don't know how to be what you need," he said. Her heart ached. "I don't need perfect," she whispered. "I just need you here." For a moment, just a moment, he reached for her hand and didn't pull away. They didn't resolve anything that night. No grand apologies, no promises. But the distance closed slightly. Enough to feel dangerous. Enough to remind Grace why she'd stayed all these years. And enough to remind Troy that avoiding the cost of love didn't erase it, it only delayed the reckoning. If you've ever needed someone to show up when you were at your weakest, stay with this story. Sometimes presence is the first step toward truth. The hospital released Grace the next afternoon. She walked slower now, one careful step at a time, Troy hovering beside her as if afraid she might vanish if he looked away. The forced closeness of the night before lingered between them, unfinished, unresolved, heavy. At home, Grace settled onto the couch with pillows arranged just so. Troy lingered in the doorway, uncertain. "I'll make soup," he said. "Doctor said light food." She nodded. "Thank you." It felt strange to hear gratitude in her own voice, for something that once would have been automatic. While Troy cooked, Grace reached for a blanket from the hall closet. That was when she saw it. A box she didn't recognize, tucked behind old winter coats. Clean. Deliberate. Recently placed. Curiosity nudged aside hesitation. Inside were documents. Medical records. Appointment slips. A transplant consultation dated 3 months before her surgery. Grace's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the papers. Troy Moore, preliminary donor compatibility screening. And beneath it, another name. A woman's. Nora Blake. Grace sat down hard on the floor, the the past rearranging itself with brutal clarity. Troy working late. Troy networking. Troy distant long before the surgery. She remembered asking once, months ago, "Are you okay? You seem far away." And him replying, "I'm just tired." "Don't worry." She had worried anyway. She had just never known why. Troy found her there. Sitting on the floor. Box open. Truth exposed. "What's this?" Grace asked quietly, holding up the paper. His face drained of color. "Grace. I can explain." "Please do," she said. "Because according to this, you were already testing someone else before you ever asked me." Silence answered first. Then Troy exhaled sharply, defeated. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "I didn't want to scare you by lying." Her voice stayed calm. That frightened him more than anger would have. He hesitated, then said the thing that would never be taken back. "I stayed longer than I wanted to," Troy admitted. "I didn't want to look like the man who left the woman who saved his life." There it was. Not guilt. Not confusion. Image. Grace felt something inside her finally give way, not her heart, but something deeper. The last illusion. "You didn't leave me," she said softly. "You waited until I couldn't run." Troy opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to defend. He moved out that night. No yelling, no slammed doors. Just boxes. Keys on the counter, a quiet house swallowing the sound of an ending. Grace sat alone on the couch, one hand resting over the scar beneath her clothes. For the first time, the pain wasn't physical. It was the realization that she had been brave for someone who had been calculating. That she had given her body to a man who only needed her long enough to survive. Later, alone in bed, Grace whispered into the dark. "Was I ever enough, or was I just convenient?" The room didn't answer. But the silence told her the truth she had been avoiding all along. She had confused sacrifice for security, and love for obligation. And now, there was nothing left to cling to. Just herself. Broken. Alone. But finally, awake. The house felt too quiet after Troy left. Not peaceful. Hollow. Grace moved through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter, the doorframe they had once marked with pencil lines and dates that now felt like artifacts from another life. She packed nothing that night. There would be time for logistics later. Lawyers. Paperwork. Explanations she didn't owe anyone. What she needed first was to decide who she would be after him. In the bathroom, Grace lifted her shirt and looked at her scar. It was longer than she remembered. Angry and red against healing skin. A permanent line where certainty used to live. She pressed her fingers gently against it, not in pain, but acknowledgement. "I gave you away," she whispered to her reflection. "My body. My loyalty. My future." Her reflection didn't look broken. It looked tired, but awake. For the first time, she didn't ask why this happened. She asked something harder. "What do I do with what's left?" Her phone buzzed. Rachel's name lit up the screen. Grace almost let it ring out. Almost chose isolation because it felt safer than vulnerability. But she answered. "I'm coming over," Rachel said. Not a question. "You don't have to." "I know," Rachel replied gently. "That's why I am." An hour later, Rachel sat on the floor beside Grace, back against the couch, both of them eating takeout straight from the containers. Grace spoke without looking up. "He left." Rachel nodded. "I know. And I don't feel angry," Grace said. "I feel clear. Is that wrong?" "No," Rachel said. "That's what happens when the truth finally stops fighting you." Grace swallowed. "I don't want revenge," she admitted. "I don't want him back. I don't even want answers anymore." Rachel glanced at her. "What do you want?" Grace took a long breath. "I want my life to belong to me again." The next morning, Grace called Dr. Nathan Cole. "I want to speak to the Donor Advocacy Board," she said. "Not to file a complaint. To help." Dr. Cole paused. "Help how?" "Education," Grace replied. "Protection. Making sure no one else gives their body thinking it guarantees love." He was quiet for a moment. I think that would matter, he said. So did she. Days turned into weeks. Grace healed slowly, physically and emotionally. She went to therapy. She joined a support group. She learned to say no without apologizing. She signed the divorce papers without ceremony. No tears. No speeches. Just a steady hand reclaiming her name. More was no longer hers. And she didn't want it back. One evening, after a donor support seminar she helped organize, Grace and Rachel sat outside on the steps, the air cool and forgiving. You're different, Rachel said softly. Not hardened. Just rooted. Grace smiled faintly. I finally stopped trying to earn love. Rachel met her gaze. And what happens when love meets you instead? Grace didn't answer right away. For the first time, the idea didn't scare her. Grace went to bed that night alone, but not lonely. She had chosen truth over comfort, self-worth over sacrifice, life over survival. And in that choice, something quietly shifted. This wasn't the end of love. It was the moment she stopped bleeding for it. Spring arrived gently, like it was afraid to startle Grace. Sunlight returned to the windows of her new apartment, small, quiet, hers. No echoes of old arguments. No rooms shaped around someone else's ambition. Just space. Clean and intentional. Grace stood at the kitchen counter slicing fruit, moving carefully but confidently. Her scar had faded from angry red to soft silver. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like proof. The donor advocacy program took off faster than anyone expected. Grace spoke in hospital conference rooms, community centers, and support groups, never as a hero, never as a victim. Just as a woman who had learned the hard way that love should never require erasure. I don't regret donating, she told one room full of listeners. But I regret believing sacrifice could replace mutual devotion. If my story protects even one person from making that mistake, then something good came from my pain. After the talk, a man approached her, quiet, respectful, mid-40s, warm eyes. I'm Daniel, he said. I lost my sister to liver disease. Your words, they mattered. Grace smiled politely. Nothing more. She wasn't looking. Weeks passed. Daniel kept showing up, not persistently, not insistently. Just present. Coffee after meetings. Shared laughter over burned pastries. Silences that didn't demand filling. One evening, walking back to her car, Grace stopped suddenly. I need to say something, she said. Daniel waited. I don't bleed for love anymore, she said honestly. I don't disappear. I don't give pieces of myself away hoping someone stays. Daniel nodded. Good, he said. I'm not looking for a sacrifice. I'm looking for a partner. Something in her chest loosened. 2 months later, exactly 1 year after the surgery, Grace stood outside the same hospital. Not as a patient. Not as a wife. But as a speaker. She paused in the hallway where she had once signed her body away for the promise of love. This time, she carried nothing but herself. Before walking in, she pressed a hand lightly over her scar. I survived, she whispered. And she meant more than just the surgery. That night, Grace sat on her balcony wrapped in a light blanket, city lights blinking below. Daniel sat beside her, not touching, just close. You okay? He asked. She smiled, soft, real. For the first time, she said, I'm not waiting to be chosen. He reached for her hand. She let him. And this time, nothing had to be lost for love to stay. If you stayed with Grace through every scar and silence, don't let her story end here. Let it live where your voice lives. If you believe love should arrive without bloodshed, if you believe healing is possible after betrayal, carry this story with you. And if it moved you, stay connected. Some stories only matter when we keep choosing to show up for them.